Hi everyone, I'm Konrad. Thank you for sticking around to some of the last talks of ETHCC on this Thursday afternoon. Today I'll be talking about account abstraction and more specifically modular account abstraction and why, at least to me, it will be the future of how smart contract wallets, also called smart accounts, will operate. So I won't go too much into depth about what account abstraction is, why we need it. There's been so many talks already, not least of which Vitalik's history on Vitalik's talk on the history of account abstraction on Ethereum. We all know there's terrible user experience today, and account abstraction promises to fix that. So very roughly, for people that haven't heard about it yet, today how you interact with Ethereum is through an externally owned account, which means you have a private key from which there's a public key derived to it. And probably the best definition I've heard about account abstraction is that on Ethereum, the execution phase, so what happens after your transaction or during the execution of your transaction, is kind of programmable. Smart contract developers can decide what happens, but the validation phase that determines whether your transaction will be executed is fixed to a specific key signature algorithm, ECDSA. And kind of what account abstraction does is it allows for that validation phase to also become programmable, which means that people can decide on using different signature algorithms or different kind of ways of verification or verifying a transaction in general. So I'm sure everyone has seen, there was a talk a few talks ago about using WebAuthn to drastically increase the user experience of using Ethereum. So kind of the ideal goal of account abstraction is to drastically reduce the friction and just make using Ethereum and EVM blockchains a lot more simple. However, we think that the infrastructure today and how smart accounts are built today is still very much lacking. So there's a couple of big problems, such as vendor lock-in. So what that means is when you create a smart account on one platform, usually it's very hard to port that account over to another front end and use it there. For example, developers might use different terminology for calling the functions, so a front end might actually not be compatible with a specific smart account that you've created somewhere else. There's also fragmentation, which means that users might be onboarded through a dApp that creates a smart contract wallet for them, but then they might not be able to offboard that off that specific UI. And over time, you might use 10 different dApps that create 10 different smart accounts for you, and then all of a sudden, managing all of these accounts is even more of a headache than having 10 different accounts in MetaMask. There's also a lack of customization for the users. So what that means is that you don't really have a control over how your smart account works. So the developer kind of decides, like I said, which key signature algorithms to use, kind of whether they're optimizing more for security, whether they're optimizing more for gas, and all stuff around that. And finally, we also think that there's a lot of duplication of engineering work, where people really only want to build certain additions that make smart accounts better, or in some cases a lot better. But actually, because of how smart accounts are built today, they have to then go and rebuild an entire account, rebuild the wallet UI, and then compete with all the other thousands of wallets that are out there already. And that just doesn't make sense most of the time, because the engineering time should be spent on actually building those features that make smart accounts overall better. So what is modular account abstraction? So we kind of think of it as smart accounts today are built in a very static and rigid fashion, which means that development cycles are very slow, upgrades are very expensive, and also audits are very costly, because after a team has kind of made some upgrades to a smart contract wallet, changed a lot of its functionality, they then have to get their entire code base re-audited. But we think that tomorrow, smart accounts will look more like Lego blocks, where either developers or users can construct the functionality of their smart accounts through simple pieces. This might be kind of exposed to them through a no-code fashion, but it might also be kind of developers building those pieces themselves and putting them together. So for example, a developer of a wallet might want to build a wallet that's very specifically focused for a use case, such as gaming, and then take these different Lego pieces that they themselves or other people have built and build that gaming wallet with all of these features that are either already out there or that they build themselves. And why is that kind of, as we think of it, a strictly better way of building smart accounts? So first of all, the smart account becomes kind of a very versatile primitive. in the future that we see, there might only be a few accounts out there that are very kind of like battle tested, very trusted, and people can build around those and don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. It also enables flexible feature design, like I said before, with no-code customization, so that even users can decide how their wallets work. And they don't have to rely on developers to tell them, now you get this feature, and now you get that feature. And it also means that upgrades and changing how those features work might be way less costly, and also potentially in some cases might kind of like be less complex on the security side in terms of auditing, because you might only need to audit specific pieces rather than have everything kind of like re-audited, like I said before. So here are some of the modules that we personally, and also some of the people that we've been talking about, have been pretty excited about. We've kind of just like grouped them into some rough rubrics. Obviously, there's a lot more both categories and ideas for modules. But these are some that, like I said, we've been pretty excited about. So some examples might be, you might want different roles in your wallet, such as admin rights, token voting, spending limits, different ways of doing recovery. So social recovery is being talked a lot about. But some users might just prefer to have a custodian that does recovery for them, which is equally fair. You might have the equivalent, or even a traditional bank that holds a key shard, or even the entire key, and kind of like does recovery for you. There's also a lot of features you can build around protection, either around like kind of exploits of the account, such as being able to freeze the account and having an allow and deny list of kind of like contracts that the account can interact with. But you can also have build really cool features around MEV protection. And finally, you might have kind of like more miscellaneous kind of like modifiers. But we also think that innovation will happen at the product level, so not necessarily, or maybe in conjunction with smart contract like modules. So you could have, for example, a lot more peer-to-peer interactions, where an asset stays in your wallet and never actually leaves your wallet, but an ephemeral key is created, given to someone else, and that key only has the ability to kind of prove ownership of that specific asset, but it can never kind of transfer that asset out. So that kind of turns how lending is done today a bit kind of like upside down. And there's also kind of like stuff around automated trading, which is why a lot of people still kind of like stay on centralized exchanges today, because you can much more easily do stuff like dollar cost averaging or triggered buys and sells. So we really think there's kind of like multiple levels of innovation that can happen using modular smart accounts. So how do we envision this ecosystem of modular smart accounts to kind of like work? What are the different components that we think are being built and need to be built in order for this to actually be ready to be used kind of like by the mainstream of Web3 users? So obviously, kind of like this is kind of like a chart. You can read it from both sides. On the left side is kind of like the user-facing stuff. So obviously, like a user has an action. They use a relaying infrastructure, such as provided by ERC 437, which kind of like standardizes how user ops, as it's called, kind of in the terminology of ERC 437, are used to trigger smart accounts. And then you might have your modular smart account. So you might be using a safe, or you might be using zero-depth kernel that has some native functionality, but that is also extended by modules. And then kind of starting from the other side, you have a developer that builds a module. Like I said before, like they might build a module for dollar cost averaging. And then the final piece that I kind of haven't talked about so far, but which we think is pretty necessary to make this ecosystem feasible, especially from a security perspective, is some sort of entity that regulates and kind of like validates how modules work and how they can be added to, and kind of like used by smart accounts. So we advise to call this a registry, and essentially that registry, the function of that registry is to allow for users to more easily trust, like I said, like how modules work and how they can be added into your account. Yeah, so for the rest of the talk, I'll kind of like zone in on that registry, on which there's a lot of work being done today. I believe Lucas in the next talk will also talk about kind of like how Safe is thinking about the security aspect of these modules. But this is kind of like a rough idea of how we've been kind of like thinking about it and been kind of like talking with different teams in the space and trying to get feedback on, yeah, kind of like the architecture and some of the constraints that you need to think about when you're building essentially this registry. And kind of for easier understanding, like one way that you could like kind of describe this registry on a high level is that it's essentially an app store for modules that are added to your smart account. And that app store, like I said, it kind of surfaces these modules and their functionality to users, but it also kind of enables them to actually trust what these modules do and whether you should or shouldn't add them. So this is like a very rough and also kind of somewhat opinionated kind of like idea of how this registry could work. So kind of on the one hand, you have users that interact with this registry, and there might be a free module or there might be a paid module that they use. And in order to kind of add this to their account, they're choosing kind of who to trust. So there might be some auditors, there might be kind of protocols that are marketplaces of auditors that kind of like verify these modules and the permissions that these modules are given, and kind of surface this to the users. And then on the other hand, like I said, there's kind of these developers that build these features that are then embedded into the smart accounts. And kind of like the final aspect, which I haven't touched on yet, is the equivalent of modularity on the smart account level also needs to be built and needs to be surfaced on the UI level. So what that means is that if I were to build a module, for example, to do dollar cost averaging from within a smart account, a normal kind of like wallet front end wouldn't really know how to use that module. It wouldn't really like know how to let you set up different strategies, how to kind of like surface to you when these strategies are being executed, what price you're getting for different swaps. So in order to actually surface that to the user, a developer would also need to build a front-end component that essentially like kind of creates this UI that lets the user interact with specific modules in that certain way. And that kind of within that also brings up a lot of like security issues of kind of like modules operating within the same DOM in the front end and kind of like using the same account and kind of like interacting with each other. So a lot of kind of work I believe is being done on that front as well. For example, by Soul Wallet, who've been thinking about domain-specific languages for modular front ends. So yeah, I encourage you to check that out as well. And yeah, I think there are a few minutes left for some questions. Is that right? Okay, I think so. So are there any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? And is there anyone with a microphone?
I don't think we have questions though.
Okay, so no time for questions?
No, the next talk is starting in like 3 minutes. So yeah, if you have any questions, please find it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if there's any questions, like you said, please come find me. And thank you for your attention. Here's a QR code where you can find more about what we're doing and also how the space is evolving. We recently wrote up a blog post that kind of very extensively describes the developments in this ecosystem so far and where we think it's headed in the future. Thank you.